First thing I'll say, because I can see dinner's being served, so please do eat. Don't feel like you need to focus on me or the screen or anything. Hopefully there will be some nuggets of wisdom or just experience to share with you this afternoon. And thanks for giving me your time. So, as Mohit said, my name's Daniel Kennedy. I manage some of Australian healthcare's earliest RPA assets at St John of God Healthcare. And I've been doing this since 2017. And I'm going to show you my story of why we started our automation journey and invite you to start or accelerate your own automation adventure. Do you mind clicking the slide for me? I have a control. I thought it was all automated here. What's going on? All right, and no crash course on this, so I'll try this one and see if it works. All right. Bear with me while I try and figure out how this technology works. So I'm going to share my 6 key takeaways with you so you can think about responsible automation in your organisation. You've no doubt, because I see a lot of familiar faces here from previous automation summits and other events, you've no doubt been aware of RPA and automation for many years and probably have mixed views or have heard mixed things about the value and viability of the technology. By the end of my presentation, you'll know why for St John of God Healthcare, we're getting great value from our automation and we're growing that value steadily. So let's start with an intro to St John of God Healthcare. And I'm pleased to hear that at least one person did actually not know this, so it's not, this slide actually serves some purpose. St John of God Healthcare is often confused with St John's, the ambulance providers. There's a picture of each. We are not the ambulance service, which is also called St John's. We are the hospital group, which is featured on the left-hand side. That's our Murdoch Hospital campus. So the ambulances come to the hospitals and deliver patients for us, but we're the ones who are providing the care, usually in a hospital, but we also provide home-based services as well. All right, so having got that out of the way, I'll talk a little bit about St John of God. And there are a few things that are worth knowing about St John of God as an organisation, and I should say St John of God Healthcare, is that we were established about 130 years ago. So we've existed for a very long time. And I think Subiaco was one of the very first sites that we had as an organisation. And some of you may be familiar with St John of God Subiaco Hospital. Other sites around the Perth area include Mount Lawley, which we acquired some years ago, and more recently established was the Midland Healthcare Campus. So for those of you who are from WA, you might be familiar with those other buildings. So established 130 years ago, and we treat about just a little under 400,000 patients in the most recent year that we had. And we do that across 27 sites for our organisation, which are based in WA, Victoria and New South Wales. Don't have anything in Northern Territory, Queensland or Tasmania or Canberra, the ACT, but we certainly have sites, hospitals across those different areas. And we have 15,500 employees. We call them caregivers, and that's a very deliberate term because it helps our employees to associate what they do with providing care to patients and their families. So that's a little bit about stats taken from the annual reports. If I look now at values, which are highly relevant to responsible automation, there are 5 values that we espouse, and there are some words that sit beneath each one of them for you to read. Hospitality, justice, respect, compassion and excellence are our organisational values. And I'm sure if you look in your own organisation, you've probably got a collection of between 4 and 6 values that your organisation holds very dearly to its heart when making decisions, particularly executive decisions and so on and so forth. So I think there are 3 values which actually underlie the way we've approached automation within St John of God Healthcare. And what I want to do is I want to focus on those 3. And the 3 that are most relevant as far as I can determine are respect, compassion and excellence. And in reverse order, excellence is something that we feel is delivered when patients receive high quality process outcomes and low costs. Everybody who comes to a hospital obviously wants to go away healthier than when they arrived or have had whatever needs to be done successfully and no complications. And cost is of course important to everybody. Respect is something that we demonstrate when we see people leveraged to exercise their skills and their passions rather than, as I think Mohit put it, mundane or tedious work. So respect is definitely another strong value for responsible automation. And compassion is something that we need to show to our caregivers, our employees, because any change can be confronting, can be difficult, and what we try to do throughout the journey that we've been on with our automation is to acknowledge the need to do no harm and actually to help people to actually profit from the change journey, which I think the Minister spoke to as well, the importance of that particular aspect. So now what I'd like to do is I'd like to take you through a couple of practical applications in a section of the agenda which I've called the tip of the iceberg. And I've called it that because for St John of God Healthcare, I'm going to show you 2 processes that we've automated, but there's actually over 30. And I don't want to go through all of them, and you'd be bored stiff if I did. So you'll be spared that fate. But I'll take you through a couple of examples. This is one of the earliest examples of process automation that we implemented, and it was done with Mindfields several years ago now, 2017, I think we embarked on the journey. And I'm going to give you a before and an after. So in the before world, you can see that the action of billing for patient visits can be broken down into 3 steps. So number 1, hospital caregivers are collecting information about the patient's journey. And actually, a hospital experience is not very different from a hotel experience. You'll check in, you will consume things while you're in the hotel and in the hospital, and those things will be noted down, and at the end of your visit, when you're discharged, there'll be a final bill. So the hospital caregivers go about collecting that information in our patient administration system, and then the baton passes to our accounts receivable team. The accounts receivable team raises a bill if the bill can be raised, and that requires a bunch of checks to be performed to determine whether or not the bill is actually going to be able to be paid by the health fund, dependent on a number of conditions and contractual obligations, stuff like that. So the third step in the process is inevitably triage, which is to say that a lot of bills can't be raised on the first time of asking, so there's a bit of liaison between AR and the hospital to say things like, we don't seem to have had some things collected on this patient visit that we would expect, or we haven't got details that will enable us to satisfy the health fund that we're going to bill their conditions. So there's an amount of backwards and forwards that goes on at the end of the process, so it's somewhat iterative in its cycle. So that's the before. In terms of after, we've got what I really liked a few years ago was called the Cobot Model, which is to say we don't use robots, but we actually have cobots. So they cooperate with the humans. And I quite like that because actually in the afterworld, what you have is the robot doing the mundane, tedious checkpoint-based stuff, but the AR caregiver is actually still doing the valuable problem-solving and critical thinking work that's involved at the back end. So you can see that automation plays a part in step 2, but not in the other 2 steps. So a few things to draw attention to that I particularly feel passionately about from my experience here. The caregivers are continuing to perform the highest value work that they can do. But the things like working through a 9-point checklist for each individual patient visit is now something they don't have to worry about because the robot will actually do that for them, and we'll just give them a bill at the end, no pun intended, to say here are the 2 things that actually need remediation. So a work list that they can then focus on. I think that's important. From an RPA perspective, the journey, and this is probably me speaking to some of the pain that I probably experienced going through this journey, there's an amount of complication that arises in considering the different health fund providers. There are about 32 across Australia, and the number of variations in terms of patient kind of individual consumption during a hospital visit varies widely as well. So being able to automate the checkpoint is actually a very elaborate and complex thing, which, if you understand those rules, is great because it can be automated, but it does lead to a lot of process variations. So that does mean that you have to have quite complicated scripts to actually handle that kind of thing. The other thing I'd like to draw out is the benefit that we particularly experienced with implementing automation in this space for billing. So on a typical day, we'll have about 4,000 to 7,000 potential bills that can be raised, and we have a team of people that are looking at that quite different range. And sometimes that can range up to 30,000 bills because we're on a contractual health fund stop because we're going through a negotiation process. So the great thing about having automation in place is those kind of peaks and troughs just even out, and in fact the automation can look at every single potential bill and raise it, Whereas when you've got a team of people, you have to think about, well, where do I constructively prioritise their effort for the highest value? And so that's something that we don't have to worry about anymore, which is fantastic from our perspective. So that's one use case in the accounts receivable world. I want to talk you through an accounts payable example now. And there are 6 steps in the process I'm describing here, which is all about invoice processing. So a supplier will send us an invoice at step 1, and in the past, this is prior to automation, some lucky person would go to the email box and print out 1,000 emails every morning, including attachments, and then go to the printer and collect something that was probably back-breaking in terms of weight and size, and then actually organise that by letter of the alphabet and provide that to a team of AP clerks. So if you're letter A, you get this many. If you're letter D, you get this many. So that kind of distribution process. The AR clerk then consumes that paper, turns it from one side of the desk to the other with the computer in the middle, and at the end of the day, all that paper is then sorted and rummaged through and put into filing cabinets and dutifully shipped off to some warehouse somewhere where we can pay $7 a month to keep it, just in case we ever need it at some point in the future. And so the process changed, again, in a very Cobot fashion after the event, because now it looks like this. So from the first point, I suppose, our suppliers are completely unaffected by anything we did. So they still send us emails, they still send us invoice attachments. What we now have is we have automation digitally storing the invoice and any attachments, keeping the email and archiving it within Outlook. So just keeping it online and digitally available. The RPA groups and the attachments by supplier and then actually does allocate them in a tool set which we've developed so that the AP clerk can go to letter A and they'll see all of the invoices that relate to letter A or letter D. And then following on the journey of the invoice, OCR reads the invoice header data for the high invoice volume suppliers, and RPA then enters that header information into our ERP. And from there, we still have some low invoice volume supplier attachments handled by AP clerks, where it doesn't profit us to use OCR, because OCR is good when you've got high volume invoices, but it's potentially a bit of an overinvestment if you're dealing with suppliers who send you 5 invoices a year, let's say. So that was the AP process, and again, I'd just like to draw out a few components of this, which I think again kind of talk to responsible automation. The AP caregiver is still doing the difficult part of this invoice management journey, which is actually matching line items to PO line items and checking that delegated authority has been exercised and checking that approvals are in place and the right people have authorised the payment before it goes out. And our ERP is still doing what ERPs do best, which is validating the invoice, using a bunch of cross-validation rules to determine, can this be processed? When will I schedule the payment, in which batch, and so on and so forth. So again, this is very much a Cobot model that we've applied, and the advantages are numerous, but some of the advantages are that we don't ship things away now after printing them off to boxes, far away. And everything is available transparently for all people to see. And that in itself is such a difference to the experience that I would have had 5 years ago, when oftentimes you'd get a complaint from a supplier and then you'd be rigging several people that you thought might have the invoice hard copy on their desk. But nowadays that doesn't happen because there's a single point of truth in our systems. And another benefit of this, ruthlessly, from a process efficiency perspective for our organisation, was our AP team was now able to achieve its target of getting invoices into the system for approval within 1 day. So difficult in the past if you had a swathe of emails, particularly after a Christmas break, and there'd be 3,000 or 4,000 emails sitting in the inbox, patiently waiting for everybody to come back to work on January the 4th or whatever day. That doesn't happen anymore. The automation can comfortably handle peaks and troughs and high workload volumes, which again is great. So the next section of what I'm going to share with you today is what I've called the Nandan Nilkeni test, and I have no idea if I pronounce his name right, so I apologise to him if I messed that up. But it's actually prompted me recently when I was reading an article by this gentleman who was the co-founder of Infosys, and he was interviewed by McKinsey. And he talked about using technology in a way that benefits people as being the clarion call for leaders of all industries. And, clearly he's speaking from a technology perspective. And I thought about whether or not I could pass this test if I thought about have the automations that we've implemented benefited people in our organisation or outside of our organisation. So I grouped the people I could think of into these 6 headings, and against each of them, I thought about whether or not there have been some benefits to them. And for patients, we have been able to hold costs or lower them in some instances. It's probably a distant kind of point on the horizon for us from saving money in AR and AP, but nonetheless, it's enabled us to contain our costs. We've not had costs that we would otherwise have had to endure, which would have had to be passed on in one form or another. So I think it has enabled us to lower costs. For our accounts receivable and accounts payable caregivers, we reduced the mundane, routine, highly repetitive tasks that, frankly, none of them really wanted to do, particularly not the poor girl who was on roster to do the printing of emails every morning. That was a horrible job that nobody wanted and had to be dished out to the group on a rostered basis. But we've done that for more than just the AP ladies. We've done it for the accounts receivable team as well. And we've given them more time for problem solving. So they're actually more able now to handle a lot of the more complex bill triage kind of problems which they just couldn't get to in the past. Or that would present a cash flow issue to us because it would take a long time for us to resolve them. So great for the AR and AP caregivers. And there was another thing that happened as well as a result of this, which was because we were taking away mundane work, we thought whether or not the jobs were actually still adequately described, and we took care to actually regrade the jobs, which led to some people getting modest pay increases. But in terms of their job description and in terms of their job satisfaction, I'd like to think that actually that went up. So hopefully some good news for our AR and AP caregivers. For other finance caregivers, and I count myself as one of them, we were able to advance our technology skills. At least I tell myself that. Whether or not I have or not is somebody else to judge. And for the organisation at large, we were able to improve our performance against SLAs, which is clearly very important in any organisation, and particularly for ours where we operate a shared service model. And it's fair to say that it reduces management overhead to use automation because we don't need to induct, recruit, train, or deal with any kind of holiday or absences with automation. Bots tend to just sit there waiting for instructions, and that's definitely a bonus for other finance caregivers. If I look outside of finance and look to people in the hospitals or look to people in other departments, because we're a shared service model, we actually provide services to not just our hospitals, but also our HR department, also our IT department, and so on and so forth. So for all of them, where we have SLAs in place, we're able to achieve them more readily, which is good news for them. And actually, just thinking about our IT team, one of the things that we have tried our best to do is to actually make sure that we're applying RPA in the right use cases. So not a hammer and everything's a nail, but very much a case of where appropriate, let's use RPA. And yeah, that's certainly been an interesting journey for me because it's helped me to learn a little bit more about what the other automation tool sets are, and there are plenty of them. So an appropriate technology choice was the thing I was supposed to put up there. Our health funds have seen reduced errors. We don't have transposition errors with automation. Humans do it about 0.5% to 1% of the time, but that doesn't happen with automation. And for our suppliers, because our invoices were getting processed more quickly, being shipped around the organisation for approval purposes and being remediated more readily, there were fewer payment delays for them. So lots of good things. Technology effectively benefiting lots of people. So I feel like I could tick the so-called, I won't say his name again, but this test that I've tried to cobble together. So from St John of God's perspective, I still see this after 5 years of embarking on this journey as a growing value proposition. And I reflect on what I think is the single biggest thing that's actually helped the journey. And it's the top line. Having a sponsor who says, I want to automate wherever I can. And that's nuanced, at least now I realise it's nuanced. And maybe I didn't at the start, because I was like, RPA, go RPA, it's this fantastic new tool set. But nowadays I think automation is actually the better word because it enables you to embrace a range of orchestration tools that you can use. And RPA can be one of those tools, doesn't have to be. But it undoubtedly has been able to fill gaps that we would not have been able to solve via another mechanism in our organisation, and I'm sure that's the case for other organisations who have adopted as well. So we now have we've got 4 automation roles over the last 3 or 4 years that have developed. Myself, I've got 2 RPA developers, and we have an automation specialist. And very roughly, the automation specialist is kind of doing the discovery work, if you think about that. The RPA developers are doing the development, deployment, testing, and I'm the bot farm manager. So I sit there and watch my bots and schedule them and run them ad hoc basis and scratch my head every time something funny goes wrong and deal with the inevitable, oh, your bots have gone wrong, and oftentimes it's not the bots actually, it's the browser or it's the application or it's another environmental factor. But nonetheless, you know, from a user's perspective, they see that the automation has failed, and I'm there to make sure that we solve those kind of issues. So that's great, and I think that the 4 goals that we've been able to achieve by having those 4 roles are listed for you: process effectiveness, cost efficiency. Who wouldn't want those things? Every organisation wants those things, don't they? Having RPA developers on site that have free rein to go wherever they please in terms of IT landscape and in terms of sensitivity of data has definitely been a massive thing for us because we've got patient data that needs to be very heavily guarded, and we've got health fund data which is also IP sensitive for obvious competitive tension reasons. So having internal resources that can respond to incidents and manage those incidents well is important. I reflect on my own sort of experience the other day actually when my wife said to me, can you tell Google to switch the lights off in the living room? And no matter how many times she said it, it wouldn't work. But I went over to her and I said, Google, switch the lights off in the living room, and it immediately worked. And you sense the frustration from, or I did, from my wife, that the technology wasn't working, and you kind of have those glitches, and people are quick to, you know, get very excited about the technology once it doesn't work. Less excited once the technology is working and can't remember that it's been a step forward, but you certainly have to watch the kind of the natural human kind of critical thinking that comes into play. So having that responsiveness is incredibly important. Obviously, we've got relatively low-cost development capability by having RPA developers within our organisation. And, you know, our ethos is about automating on value to people. If I think back to my 30 processes that we've automated at St John of God Healthcare, a number of them were absolutely done for net present value reasons, right? So business case was originally approved on the basis of NPV, IRR, all the customary things that business cases are usually signed off for. But with the sponsor saying the top line up there internally in the organisation, we don't talk about that at all. We don't talk about NPV or IRR. We talk about value to people. We talk about reducing the mundane and the tedious for the people who have got better things to do with their time. And it would only be fair to say that we leverage associated technologies. So we rely upon things like Oracle. We rely upon things like Microsoft SharePoint. We rely upon data warehouses because we get a lot of our information analytics from that, which sometimes actually is a feeder process for our automation orchestrations. So we definitely rely on those. And of course, we rely upon capable and contemporary automation software. Shout out to Automation Anywhere from our perspective. So, you know, it's great to have the toolkits that actually work reliably for us. So if you'll indulge me for just one more minute or so, I'm going to talk a little bit about my favourite ingredients for automation. So taking the first one, digitising and standardising dramatically improves your automation feasibility. When you're dealing with paper, clearly that is a significant barrier. And if you don't know what your process is, it isn't documented, that obviously is a problem. And when you don't have standardisation, that just increases the complexity and broadens out your development timescale. So digitising and standardising, incredibly important. We've learnt through our journey that partial process automation is okay and actually is sought. Sometimes the automation that you build tomorrow was scaffolded on the automation you developed today. When we started the journey, we were looking at end-to-end processes. We were trying to solve the world to boil the ocean, you know, to use a well-worn phrase. Now we try to go to the ocean with a kettle and come back, and, you know, that takes a couple of minutes to boil the ocean. I'm not sure how long that would take, depending on which one you pick. So partial process automation is definitely okay from our perspective. A technology team is all about that, I think, that entwining of different tool sets, different automation opportunities. So don't just go to RPA. Look for native automation, look for APIs, look for using your enterprise service bus, look at your entire suite of tools that are available in your IT toolkit. And once you have any automation in place, make sure that you're able to fix it. So plan for asset maintenance, because I can remember some pretty horrible times when we first implemented, where stakeholders and people who were still kind of dealing with change in their own way would come at me because the automation had failed. And if I wasn't able to respond to that quickly, I think that automation could easily have actually become, a flavour of another day rather than something that we wanted to continue with. Identifying and maintaining the catalyst for your change is incredibly important. I'll come back again to the sponsor, initially NPV and all the usual reasons, but latterly coming back to actually making people's jobs easier to do or giving them back time so that they can do higher value tasks is absolutely what we've been doing now for 3 or 4 years. And relentlessly pursuing benefits to people is common sense, because any human being resists being drawn on a change journey that they don't like. So you have to bring people with you, just as the Minister himself said earlier on. And I also like avoiding a technology bias. It's often the case that giving an RPA developer a problem to solve, they'll come up with an RPA solution. But actually what we try to do is we try to have an enterprise architecture type discussion, and we'll actually broker a business process problem that comes to me for RPA. We'll actually broker that with other people in the organisation to determine whether or not actually we should be using native automation within an existing toolset. So the final thought to share with you, in closing my presentation, I think this quote's relevant on a number of levels, because I reflect back to 2014 when I first became aware of RPA for the first time, and it was a job-killing revolution. 40 to 60% of people worldwide in semi-skilled labour would lose their jobs by 2020 or thereabouts. Didn't happen, obviously, but that was the mantra at the time, and that presumably drove an amount of hype. And of course, automation is an opportunity to reduce costs, but for some organisations, or for all organisations, there's broader benefits. If you can think about process quality improvements and improving job satisfaction by reducing robotic and tedious work. So if responsible automation is using technology to benefit people, then that's a change journey that I want to be a part of. Thank you.
Foot, who is head for automation anywhere for South Pacific, including ANZ Bank. He just joined this position recently, 2 months back, and he's flown for